I woke up that January morning to find my driveway empty of snow and a half-ton of rock salt missing from the corner of my garage, where I had been storing it since November. My name is Nathan Irving, and I live in a planned community called Meadowbrook Estates in Aurora, Illinois. It is not a fancy place, just one of those cookie-cutter subdivisions built in the early 2000s where every third house looks identical. And the HOA thinks they run a small nation instead of managing some sidewalks and a retention pond. I had been living here for 3 years, mostly keeping my head down and paying my dues on time, which apparently made me an easy target for what happened next. The rock salt situation started because I own a small landscaping business. Every winter, I pivot to snow removal and salting services for commercial properties around the Chicago suburbs. Business had been good that season, so I had ordered a bulk supply of rock salt at a discounted rate back in November, about 2,000 pounds of the stuff. My garage is oversized, one of the reasons I bought this particular house, so storing half of that supply there made perfect sense. The rest I kept at a small warehouse I rent with 2 other contractors near Naperville. When I walked into my garage that morning to grab my equipment for a job, I immediately noticed the empty space where 12 50-pound bags should have been stacked. The tarp I kept over them was gone too. My first thought was theft, but my garage had been locked, and there was no sign of forced entry. Then I noticed something else. Tire tracks in the light dusting of snow leading from my driveway, and my side gate was hanging open slightly. I walked outside and saw that not only was my driveway clear, but so was the entire cul-de-sac where I lived. All 8 houses on our little circle had been meticulously salted, along with the sidewalks. It looked professional, like someone had used a broadcast spreader. My broadcast spreader, I realized with growing anger, which I also kept in that corner of the garage, and which was now sitting in my driveway with salt residue still visible in the hopper. Before I could even process what had happened, my neighbor from across the street, an older guy named Bill who mostly stayed out of HOA drama, walked over with his coffee mug. "Hell of a job they did this morning," he said, nodding at the clear pavement. "Didn't even wake me up. Must have come through at like 5 in the morning. Who did?" I asked, though I was already forming a pretty clear picture. HOA hired some crew, I guess. First time they've ever salted the individual streets. Usually they just do the main roads through the development. He took a sip of coffee. "Weird timing, though. We only got like an inch last night. Hardly seems necessary." I felt my jaw clench. "Bill, did this crew happen to take the salt from my garage?" He looked confused. "Your garage? I don't know, man. I just woke up to everything already done." I went back inside and immediately sent an email to the HOA management company, a soulless corporate entity called Premier Community Solutions that handled about 30 subdivisions in the area. I explained very clearly that someone had entered my property without permission, taken my commercial salt supply, and used my equipment. I wanted answers and I wanted compensation. The response came 2 hours later from a woman named Deborah Pembroke, who I knew was the HOA president and the absolute worst kind of busybody. She was in her early 50s, always wore fleece vests with the Meadowbrook Estates logo embroidered on them, and treated the neighborhood like her personal fiefdom. Her email was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive deflection. "Dear Mr. Irving, thank you for your concern. The HOA maintenance team performed routine winter safety maintenance this morning using available materials. As per Section 7.3.2 of the Community Guidelines, the HOA reserves the right to access homeowner property for emergency maintenance purposes. This was done for the safety and benefit of all residents. We appreciate your understanding. I read it 3 times, my blood pressure rising with each pass. Available materials. They had stolen my salt and were now trying to frame it as some kind of community service for which I should be grateful. I immediately called the Premier Community Solutions office and asked to speak with someone about the incident. The receptionist put me through to a property manager named Kyle, who sounded like he would rather be anywhere else. "Yeah, so the thing is," Kyle said in a monotone voice, "Miss Pembroke authorized the salting operation. There was some concern about liability with the cold snap. The maintenance supervisor said they were short on materials, and Miss Pembroke told them to use whatever was available in the neighborhood." "Whatever was available in my locked garage," I said. "That's called theft, Kyle." "Well, it's a little complicated," he replied. "Technically, the HOA does have some access provisions in the CC and Arctic S. I would have to look into the specifics." "You do that," I said. "And while you are looking into it, you can let Miss Pembroke know that I will be sending an invoice for the salt and equipment use. Market rate, not the bulk discount I got." Kyle made some non-committal noise and promised someone would get back to me. I knew that someone would be Deborah, and I was already preparing for that conversation. The invoice took me about an hour to prepare. I itemized everything: 600 pounds of rock salt at market rate, which was about 3 times what I had paid for it due to the bulk discount. Equipment rental for my broadcast spreader. Storage fees for having kept the salt in a climate-controlled garage, and a convenience fee for the unauthorized access to my property. The total came to $847. I printed it out on official invoice paper with my business letterhead, made 3 copies, and hand-delivered one to Deborah's house that afternoon. She lived in one of the larger models on the north side of the development, the kind with the 3-car garage and the professionally landscaped yard that looked like a golf course, even in winter. Deborah answered the door wearing one of her signature fleece vests, this one in navy blue. Her blonde hair was cut in that specific suburban mom style that somehow communicated both authority and a desire to speak to the manager. She looked at me like I had just tracked mud across her white carpet. "Mr. Irving," she said, not quite making it sound like a greeting. "Miss Pembroke." I handed her the invoice. "Payment is due within 30 days as indicated. Cash or check is fine." She glanced at the paper, and her expression shifted from annoyed to incredulous. "You cannot be serious." "Completely serious. Your maintenance team used my property without permission." "This is what it costs." "This is absurd," she said, waving the invoice. "The HOA was performing a community service. We were keeping everyone safe, including you." "Then the HOA should have used its own materials," I replied calmly. "Not mine. I run a business, Miss Pembroke." "That salt was inventory. You cost me money." She actually laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "You're trying to charge us $800 for some salt. Good luck with that. This invoice is going directly into the trash." "That's your choice," I said. "But I'm well within my rights to bill you for materials and equipment used. If you don't want to pay, we can let a small claims court sort it out." Her face went red. "Are you threatening to sue the HOA?" "I'm informing you that I expect to be compensated for my property. How that happens is up to you." The door slammed in my face hard enough that I felt the air pressure change. I walked back to my house feeling oddly satisfied. I knew Deborah would not just roll over, but I also knew I had the law on my side. She had taken my property without permission and used it. That was pretty cut and dried. What I did not expect was how quickly things would escalate. 2 days later, I received a formal letter from Premier Community Solutions informing me that I was in violation of Community Guidelines Section 12.4.1 for operating a commercial business from my residential property. The letter cited my salt storage as evidence of commercial activity and gave me 15 days to remove all business-related materials from my garage or face daily fines of $50. I actually had to sit down when I read it. The sheer audacity of the move was almost impressive. They had stolen my salt, and now they were trying to fine me for having stored it in the first place. I called my lawyer that afternoon. His name was Marcus Webb, and I had used him a few years back when a client tried to stiff me on a landscaping job. He was good at dealing with petty disputes and did not charge an arm and a leg. "So let me get this straight," Marcus said after I explained everything. "They took your salt without asking, used it, and are now trying to fine you for having salt. That's the situation. And you have proof that the salt was yours. Purchase records, that kind of thing, receipts, invoice from the supplier, everything." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Okay, here's what we're going to do. First, you're going to send a cease and desist letter to the HOA regarding the fines. I'll draft it. Second, we're going to file in small claims court for the value of the salt and equipment. Third, if they want to push the commercial activity angle, we'll argue that storing personal property for occasional business use doesn't constitute running a commercial operation from the residence." "How strong is their case on that?" I asked. "Weak, but HOAs can be unpredictable. Technically, a lot of CC and Articus have vague language about commercial activity, but storing some salt in your garage, that's not running a business. That's just storage. You're not seeing clients there, you're not operating heavy machinery at all hours. You should be fine." "Should be." Nothing's ever 100% with HOAs, Nathan. They play by their own rules until a judge tells them otherwise. The cease and desist letter went out the next day. Marcus made it very formal and very clear. The fines were retaliatory and without merit, and any attempt to collect them would result in additional legal action. He also formally demanded payment of my invoice within 14 days. Deborah's response was to call an emergency HOA board meeting to discuss my ongoing violations and hostile behavior toward community management. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening at the community clubhouse, which was really just a glorified shed with some folding chairs and a kitchenette. I showed up with Marcus, which seemed to surprise everyone there. The board consisted of Deborah, a timid guy named Roger who always agreed with whatever Deborah said, and a woman named Patricia who seemed perpetually confused about what was happening. About 15 other residents showed up too, mostly people who treated these meetings like evening entertainment. Bill from across the street gave me a supportive nod when I walked in. Deborah started the meeting by reading the community guidelines about commercial activity, making sure to emphasize every mention of restrictions and violations. Then she presented her case. I was running a landscaping business from my home, storing commercial quantities of materials, and causing potential liability issues for the community. "Furthermore," she said, looking directly at me, "Mr. Irving has responded to the HOA's reasonable enforcement actions with legal threats and frivolous invoicing. This kind of hostile behavior undermines the community spirit we've worked so hard to build." Marcus stood up before I could say anything. "If I may address the board," Deborah looked like she wanted to refuse, but Patricia nodded, and Marcus took that as permission. "My client stored personal property in his garage. This property was taken without his knowledge or consent and used for HOA purposes. Mr. Irving has simply requested compensation for this use, which is his legal right. The attempt to reframe this as a commercial violation is both transparent and, frankly, retaliatory." He pulled out a folder. I have documentation here showing that at least 6 other residents in this community operate businesses from their homes or store business-related materials on their property. Should we expect enforcement actions against all of them as well?" The room got very quiet. Deborah's face went through several shades of red. "That's different," she said finally. "How so? Those residents aren't causing problems or threatening the HOA with lawsuits." "So you're admitting this enforcement is retaliatory?" Roger jumped in, his voice nervous. "I think what Deborah means is that there's a pattern of behavior here that's concerning." Marcus smiled, and it was not a friendly expression. "The pattern I see is this. The HOA took Mr. Irving's property without permission. When he requested compensation, the HOA retaliated with manufactured violations. That's not enforcement. That's harassment." The meeting devolved from there. Several residents started arguing with each other about whether the HOA had overstepped. Bill stood up and said he thought the whole thing was ridiculous and the HOA should just pay for the salt. Patricia looked increasingly uncomfortable. Deborah kept trying to regain control, insisting this was about community standards and setting precedents. Finally, Marcus cut through the noise. "Here's what's going to happen. My client is filing a small claims case for the value of the materials and equipment used without his permission. The court date will be set within the next few weeks. The HOA can either settle this now for the invoiced amount, or we can let a judge decide. Either way, the retaliatory fines stop immediately, or we'll be adding harassment and abuse of authority to the complaint." We left right after that. I could hear raised voices continuing behind us as we walked to the parking lot. "Think they'll settle?" I asked Marcus. "Honestly, no. Deborah strikes me as the type who would rather spend thousands on principle than admit she was wrong. But we'll win in court. This is pretty straightforward." He was right about Deborah. 3 days later, I received another letter doubling down on the commercial violation fines and adding new citations for causing community discord and unauthorized legal representation at an HOA meeting. "They really wrote that," Marcus said when I showed him. "Unauthorized legal representation. That's not even a thing. So what do? We file the small claims case and document everything. Every letter, every fine notice, every communication. When we get in front of a judge, we're going to show a clear pattern of harassment." The small claims filing happened the following week. The court date was set for 6 weeks out, which meant I had to deal with escalating nonsense from Deborah for another month and a half. The fines kept coming. She cited me for having my work truck parked in my driveway overnight, even though I had been parking it there for 3 years without issue. She cited me for a supposed oil stain on my driveway that I'm pretty sure she created by spilling something there herself. She even tried to cite me for disrupting community harmony because I had discussed the salt incident with my neighbors. Each fine was $50. Each one went straight to Marcus, who added them to our growing file of evidence. But Deborah was not content with just fines. She also started a whisper campaign. Suddenly, neighbors who had always been friendly were giving me odd looks. Someone left a note on my truck calling me a lawsuit-happy troublemaker. My business email received an anonymous message warning potential clients that I was difficult to work with and litigious. I knew it was Deborah because the email included specific details about the HOA dispute that only someone involved would know. Marcus said we could potentially add defamation to the case, but he recommended focusing on the core issue first. The worst part was the damage to my business reputation in the neighborhood. 2 clients who lived in adjacent subdivisions called to cancel their snow removal contracts, citing concerns about professionalism. I lost about $3,000 in revenue because Deborah had decided to make me her personal enemy. Bill came over one evening in late February with a bottle of bourbon and some information. So I did some digging, he said, pouring us both generous glasses. Talked to some people who have been here longer than either of us. Turns out this is not the first time Deborah's pulled something like this. Really? Oh yeah. About 4 years ago, before you moved in, she got into it with a family on Oak Street. They had put up a play structure in their backyard that was apparently 2 inches taller than the guidelines allowed. She made their lives hell for 6 months. Daily fines, threatening letters, the whole 9 yards. Eventually, they just sold the house and moved. That's insane. Bill nodded, sipping his drink. She's got this thing where she needs to be in control. Anyone who challenges her becomes a target. The problem is that most people here just want to live their lives quietly. They pay the dues, follow the rules, and hope Deborah leaves them alone. You're the first person in a while who's actually fought back. Lucky me. Actually, yeah, Bill said. Because people are starting to notice. At the meeting the other day, a lot of folks were on your side even if they did not speak up. Deborah's been getting more and more aggressive with enforcement over the past year. People are tired of it. Your case might be the thing that finally puts her in check. That was encouraging, but it did not help with the immediate problem of lost business and mounting stress. I barely slept the week before the court date, going over everything with Marcus multiple times to make sure we had not missed anything. The small claims hearing was held at the Kane County Courthouse in Geneva. It was a surprisingly informal setting. Just a small courtroom with the judge sitting at a desk rather than an elevated bench. Deborah showed up with a lawyer from Premier Community Solutions, a slick-looking guy in an expensive suit who immediately tried to get the case dismissed on technical grounds. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Judge Patricia Hernandez, was not having it. Counsel, I've reviewed the filings. The plaintiff is claiming unauthorized use of personal property and seeking compensation. The defendant is claiming the use was authorized under HOA bylaws. That's a factual dispute we need to hear. Motion denied. Let's proceed. Marcus presented our case first. He walked through the timeline of events, showed photos of my garage with the salt storage area, and presented receipts proving I had purchased the salt for commercial use. He introduced evidence of the HOA's admission that they had used materials from my property. Then he showed the retaliatory fine notices and letters documenting Deborah's escalating harassment campaign. Your Honor, Marcus concluded, this is a straightforward case of taking someone's property without permission. The defendant's argument seems to be that HOA bylaws give them carte blanche to access homeowner property and use materials at will. That's not what the bylaws say, and even if it were, it would be an unconscionable overreach of authority. The HOA lawyer, whose name was Richard something, argued that the bylaws did give the HOA emergency access rights for maintenance and safety purposes. He claimed that the salting operation was a necessary emergency response to hazardous conditions, and that using readily available materials was within the scope of that authority. Judge Hernandez stopped him mid-argument. Counsel, did the HOA ask Mr. Irving if they could use his salt before taking it? Well, no, Your Honor, but the emergency nature of the situation required immediate action. What was the emergency exactly? Richard fumbled through his papers. There was ice and snow on the roads, creating hazardous conditions. And was this the first snow of the winter? No, Your Honor. Had the community managed previous snow events without needing to take resident property? Yes. But so what made this particular situation an emergency requiring the unauthorized taking of Mr. Irving's property? Richard did not have a good answer. He talked in circles about liability concerns and community safety standards, but it was clear he had no solid legal ground to stand on. Then Deborah herself took the stand to testify, and things got interesting. Marcus questioned her about the decision to use my salt. She insisted it was a reasonable use of available resources for community benefit. He asked if she had attempted to contact me before taking it. She said there was not time. He asked how the maintenance crew knew the salt was there. She said they must have seen it while doing other work. Miss Pembroke, Marcus said, did you personally give the maintenance crew access to Mr. Irving's garage? I may have mentioned where materials could be found, she said stiffly. So you knew the salt was there. You knew it belonged to Mr. Irving, and you made a conscious decision to have it taken and used without asking him or compensating him. It was for the benefit of the community, including Mr. Irving himself. That was not the question. Did you make a conscious decision to use his property without permission? Deborah's face flushed. The HOA has authority to manage community maintenance. Yes or no, Miss Pembroke? Did you authorize taking his salt without asking him first? Yes, she finally said, but it was justified. Marcus presented the stack of retaliatory fines and letters. And these enforcement actions against Mr. Irving, they all came after he objected to the unauthorized use of his property, correct? Mr. Irving was in violation of multiple community guidelines. Guidelines that had not been enforced against him in 3 years of residence, until he requested compensation for the salt. Is that a coincidence? Richard objected, but Judge Hernandez overruled him and told Deborah to answer. The violations came to our attention as we were reviewing his property, Deborah said carefully, because he complained about the salt. That may have prompted the review, yes. Judge Hernandez asked a few questions of her own about the HOA's policies and procedures. It became very clear that there was no formal policy about accessing homeowner property, and that Deborah had essentially made up the justification as she went along. The judge took about 5 minutes to render her decision. I find in favor of the plaintiff, she said. The defendant's argument that HOA bylaws authorize the taking and use of homeowner property without consent or compensation is without merit. While HOAs do have certain access rights for emergency maintenance, those rights do not extend to appropriating personal property for use. The defendant will pay the plaintiff the full amount of the invoice submitted, $847, plus court costs and interest. She looked directly at Deborah. Furthermore, I am ordering the defendant to cease all retaliatory enforcement actions against the plaintiff. The pattern of behavior documented here strongly suggests abuse of authority. If Mr. Irving reports further harassment, I will not hesitate to impose additional sanctions. It was a complete victory. Marcus and I walked out of the courthouse into cold March sunshine, and I felt like I could breathe properly for the first time in weeks. That went well, Marcus said with considerable understatement. You think she'll actually stop, after what the judge said? She'd be insane not to. But we'll keep monitoring. If she tries anything else, we go back to court and things get much worse for her. The HOA cut me a check within a week, $847 plus $192 in court costs. I deposited it with deep satisfaction. But the story did not end there, because Deborah had made a critical error during the court proceedings. When she testified that she may have mentioned where my salt was located, she had inadvertently admitted that the maintenance crew had not discovered it themselves. That meant someone had gone onto my property specifically to scout it, likely Deborah herself, and then directed others to enter and take the salt. That was trespassing. And since the value of the salt was over $500, it was potentially criminal. Bill came over the day after the court hearing with news that lit the fuse on the whole thing. "You know Sam Rodriguez over on Birch Court?" Bill asked. "Not really. I think I've waved at him." "Well, he was at the HOA meeting, sitting in the back. He used to be a cop, retired from Aurora PD a few years ago. He heard Deborah's testimony about accessing your property and wanted me to tell you something." "What's that?" "He thinks you might have grounds for criminal charges. Trespassing at minimum, possibly theft depending on how the prosecutor sees it. He said if you're interested, he knows people at the police department who would take it seriously." I sat with that information for a few days. Part of me just wanted to be done with the whole mess. I had my money. The judge had sided with me, and Deborah was legally prohibited from retaliating. Going to the police felt like escalation. But then I thought about the family Bill had mentioned, the ones who had been harassed into selling their home. I thought about how Deborah had tried to destroy my business reputation with lies and rumors. I thought about the pattern of behavior Judge Hernandez had noted, and how it would continue unless someone actually held Deborah accountable. So I went to the Aurora Police Department and filed a report. The officer who took my statement was a young guy who looked skeptical at first. HOA disputes were not exactly high-priority police work. But when I showed him the court documents, including Deborah's testimony admitting she had directed the taking of my property, his attitude changed. "Hold on a second," he said, and went to talk to someone in another office. He came back with an older detective, a woman named Sharon Kowalski, who read through everything carefully. "Mr. Irving," Detective Kowalski said, "what you're describing is potentially criminal trespass and theft. The value of the property taken pushes it into class a misdemeanor territory at minimum. I'm going to take this to the prosecutor's office for review, but I think they'll want to pursue it." "Really? Really? We see HOA disputes all the time, mostly civil matters that we can't get involved in. But this crosses the line into criminal behavior. Miss Pembroke admitted under oath to directing the unauthorized entry onto your property and taking of your belongings. That's not an HOA being overzealous. That's theft." The Kane County State's Attorney's Office moved faster than I expected. Within 2 weeks, Detective Kowalski called to tell me that charges were being filed against Deborah Pembroke and the maintenance supervisor who had actually carried out the taking of my salt, a guy named Eddie Marsh. "Both are being charged with criminal trespass to property and theft," Kowalski explained. "Marsh is cooperating and says Miss Pembroke specifically told him where your salt was and to use it. She's denying it now, but she already testified otherwise in civil court, so her credibility is shot." The news hit the neighborhood like a bomb. Suddenly, the quiet little HOA dispute was a criminal matter with actual arrests. Deborah hired a criminal defense attorney and went into full bunker mode, refusing to comment to anyone. Eddie Marsh apparently took a plea deal almost immediately, agreeing to testify against Deborah in exchange for probation. The preliminary hearing was in April. I had to testify again, going through the same story. Deborah's defense attorney tried to argue that she had reasonably believed the HOA bylaws gave her authority to access my property, and that there was no criminal intent. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Angela Park, demolished that argument by pointing to the civil court judgment and Deborah's own testimony admitting she knew she was taking my property without permission. The judge bound the case over for trial, setting a date in June. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened in the neighborhood. Bill had been right that people were tired of Deborah's authoritarian approach. Once the criminal charges became public, Other residents started coming forward with their own stories of harassment and overreach. The family on Oak Street, who had moved away, actually drove back to give statements about what Deborah had put them through. A petition started circulating to remove Deborah from the HOA board. The bylaws required a 2/3 vote of all homeowners to remove a board member. That was a high bar, but the petition got there in 3 weeks. The special election was held in early May, and Deborah was voted out overwhelmingly. She showed up to the meeting where the vote was announced, standing in the back with her arms crossed, looking like she wanted to burn the place down. When the results were read, she walked out without a word. Patricia, the confused board member, took over as interim president. One of her first acts was to issue a formal apology to me on behalf of the HOA and to implement new policies requiring explicit written approval before accessing any homeowner's property for any reason. The criminal trial happened on a hot day in mid-June. I took the morning off work to be there, even though my testimony was not needed since I had already given it at the preliminary hearing. Deborah looked diminished in the courtroom, wearing a conservative gray suit instead of her signature fleece vest. Her attorney made a last-ditch effort to get a dismissal, arguing that the charges were disproportionate to the offense and that this was really a civil matter. Judge Hernandez, the same judge from the small claims case, was presiding over the criminal trial by coincidence, and she was not sympathetic. "Counsel," she said, "I presided over the civil case that led to these charges." I heard the defendant admit under oath that she knowingly directed the taking of the plaintiff's property without permission. The fact that she did so in her capacity as HOA president does not shield her from criminal liability for theft and trespass. Motion denied. The trial itself was short. Eddie Marsh testified that Deborah had specifically told him where my salt was stored and ordered him to take it for the HOA salting operation. He said he had expressed concern about taking someone's personal property, but Deborah had assured him it was allowed under HOA rules. Text messages between them confirmed this account. I testified about discovering the salt missing and the subsequent retaliation when I objected. The prosecutor introduced all the civil court documents and Deborah's testimony from that case. Deborah took the stand in her own defense, which her attorney probably should have prevented. She insisted she had believed in good faith that the HOA had authority to use resident property for community purposes. She claimed the bylaws were ambiguous and that she had been trying to act in the best interests of everyone. On cross-examination, Prosecutor Park asked her a simple question. "Miss Pembroke, did you call Mr. Irving before taking his salt?" "No, but did you leave him a note or send him an email informing him of what you were doing?" "There was not time." "Did you attempt to compensate him afterward?" "I did not believe compensation was necessary. Even after he sent you an invoice, the invoice was outrageous." It was clearly an attempt to exploit the situation. So rather than discuss compensation, you began issuing fines against Mr. Irving for unrelated violations. Those were legitimate enforcement actions. That happened to start the day after he requested compensation. Deborah did not have a good answer for that. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. They found Deborah guilty on both counts, criminal trespass to property and theft. Sentencing happened 2 weeks later. Deborah's attorney argued for probation, emphasizing her lack of prior criminal record and her years of community service. Prosecutor Park argued for jail time, pointing to the abuse of authority and the retaliatory harassment campaign. Judge Hernandez split the difference in a way that felt appropriate. "Miss Pembroke," she said, "you abused a position of trust within your community. You used your authority as HOA president not to serve your neighbors, but to act as a petty tyrant. When someone challenged your actions, you engaged in a sustained campaign of retaliation. The fact that this behavior was enabled by bureaucratic power does not make it less harmful. She sentenced Deborah to 6 months in jail, suspended pending successful completion of 2 years of probation. The conditions included community service, restitution to me for court costs and lost business income, and a permanent ban from serving in any HOA leadership position. Deborah's face was white as she listened to the sentence. Her attorney immediately filed notice of appeal, but I later heard that she dropped it after a few months when it became clear she had no viable grounds. The aftermath was almost anticlimactic. Deborah and her husband put their house up for sale within a month of the sentencing. They moved to somewhere in Indiana, according to Bill. The house sold quickly, and I never saw her again. The HOA under Patricia's leadership became almost aggressively reasonable. They started sending out newsletters explaining enforcement decisions and asking for resident input before making major policy changes. The whole atmosphere of the neighborhood shifted from fearful compliance to something approaching actual community. I kept running my landscaping business, and the controversy actually ended up being good for me professionally. Several other subdivisions heard about my case and reached out about snow removal contracts, specifically citing the fact that I had stood up to an abusive HOA as a reason they wanted to work with me. My business grew by about 30% over the following year. Bill and I became good friends. We started a tradition of sitting on my driveway on nice evenings with beers, watching the neighborhood go about its business in peace. Other neighbors would sometimes join us. It became a little informal social hour that probably would have given Deborah an aneurysm if she had still been around to see it. One evening in late summer, about a year after the whole thing started, Bill and I were in our usual spots when his wife came over with news. "Did you see the email from the HOA?" she asked. "I don't really read those anymore," Bill admitted. "Well, you should read this one. They're voting on renaming the Community Guidelines document. They want to call it the Irving Protocol." I nearly choked on my beer. "They want to what?" "Apparently, Patricia proposed it. She said the whole ordeal with you taught the community important lessons about respecting homeowner rights and limiting HOA authority. The new guidelines reflect those lessons, so she wants to name them after you as a reminder." "That's insane," I said. "It's also kind of hilarious." The proposal actually went to a vote. I abstained, obviously, but it passed with about 60% support. The official Meadowbrook Estates Community Guidelines were formally renamed the Irving Protocol, which made me feel both honored and slightly embarrassed every time I heard it mentioned. The document itself was actually a significant improvement over the old version. It clearly delineated HOA authority and homeowner rights, established transparent processes for enforcement actions, created an appeal mechanism for disputes, and explicitly prohibited accessing homeowner property without written permission, except in genuine emergencies defined by specific criteria. Other HOAs in the area heard about it and started requesting copies to use as models for their own governance reforms. The whole thing took on a life of its own. I ended up being interviewed by a local newspaper about HOA reform, which was surreal. The reporter asked me what advice I would give to homeowners dealing with overreaching HOAs. "Document everything," I said. "Every interaction, every letter, every fine notice. Keep receipts, take photos, save emails, and don't be afraid to stand up for yourself." A lot of HOAs rely on people being too intimidated or too busy to fight back. But your property rights matter. The law is on your side if you're willing to use it. The article ended up getting picked up by a few other publications, and I got phone calls from homeowners as far away as Michigan asking for advice on their own HOA disputes. I was not a lawyer and could not give legal advice, but I connected several people with Marcus who appreciated the referrals. Looking back on the whole experience, the thing that struck me most was how quickly reasonable people could be cowed by someone with a little bit of authority and a lot of audacity. Deborah had not actually had any real power. She was the president of a neighborhood HOA, not a government official. But she had acted like she ran a police state, and for years people had just accepted it because fighting back seemed like too much trouble. All it took was one person saying no and actually following through. The legal process was not even that complicated. Small claims court, some documentation, and standing firm when she tried to retaliate. The criminal charges were almost incidental, a consequence of her own choices and admissions. The salt itself became kind of a running joke in the neighborhood. Every winter, people would ask if I had my supply locked up. A few neighbors even started buying their own salt and leaving it prominently in their garages with joking signs like HOA keep out or touch this and I call Nathan's lawyer. In the second winter after the incident, we got hit with a real blizzard, the kind that dumps 18 inches overnight and shuts down the whole region. The HOA, now much more cautious about liability, put out a call asking if any residents had equipment or materials they would be willing to let the association use for snow clearing. I actually donated a few bags of salt, which I made sure to document with a formal letter of donation specifying exactly what was being provided and authorizing its use. Patricia sent back a thank you letter and a gift card to a local restaurant, which was completely unnecessary but appreciated. Marcus thought the whole thing was hilarious. From theft victim to voluntary donor, character growth, he joked. More like covering my ass, I replied. If I'm going to let them use my salt, it's going to be on the record and voluntary. The business continued to thrive. I hired 2 part-time employees to help with the growing workload and bought a second truck. The warehouse space I shared with other contractors became too small, so I ended up leasing my own space near Montgomery. Things were genuinely good, which felt strange after the months of stress and conflict. I ran into Eddie Marsh, the maintenance supervisor who had actually taken my salt at a hardware store in Naperville. He recognized me and looked like he wanted to vanish into the floor. "Mr. Irving," he said awkwardly, "I just wanted to say I'm really sorry about everything. I should have known better than to listen to Miss Pembroke." "You were put in a bad position," I said, which was generous but felt true. "How are you doing?" "Okay, I guess. I finished probation last month." Lost my job with Premier Community Solutions, obviously, but I'm doing maintenance work for a property management company in Oswego now. Learned a valuable lesson about following orders without thinking them through. We talked for a few more minutes. He seemed genuinely remorseful, and I did not see any point in holding a grudge. He had been a tool Deborah used, not the architect of the situation. The civil judgment and the criminal restitution meant I ended up being compensated well beyond the original $847. The court ordered Deborah to pay me for lost business income, which my accountant calculated at around $3,200 based on the canceled contracts. She also had to pay all my legal fees from both the civil and criminal proceedings, which added up to several thousand more. I did not actually expect to see all of it. People who are ordered to pay restitution often just ignore it and deal with the probation violations later. But Deborah apparently wanted to put the whole thing behind her. I received a series of checks over about 8 months, each one from her personal account, each one a visible reminder that actions have consequences. The last check arrived in January, almost exactly 2 years after the morning I found my salt missing. It was for $718, the final amount owed. I deposited it and sent a formal letter to her probation officer confirming that restitution had been paid in full. That felt like the true end of the story. The debt was satisfied, literally and figuratively. Deborah had paid for what she took and then some. The HOA had reformed its practices. The neighborhood was functioning better. My business was thriving. Justice, in its imperfect way, had been served. Bill and I were on the driveway that evening when I told him about the final check. "So it's really over?" he asked. "Yeah, finally." "What are you going to do with all that money? You ended up making pretty good money off this whole mess." I had actually thought about that. "I'm going to donate some of it. There's a legal aid fund that helps people with housing disputes." Figured I could help someone else who's dealing with a bad HOA but can't afford a lawyer. "That's very noble of you. It's practical. The only reason I could fight back was because I had the money to hire Marcus. A lot of people don't. They just get steamrolled." I ended up donating $2,500 to the Chicago Volunteer Legal Services Foundation, specifically earmarked for their housing practice group. They sent me a nice thank you letter and told me it would help fund representation for about 3 clients dealing with landlord or HOA disputes. The rest of the money went into my business, specifically into buying a new commercial snow blower that made winter operations much more efficient. I joked that it was funded by Deborah's petness, which made using it especially satisfying. Life moved on. The neighborhood drama faded into the background, occasionally referenced but no longer the defining characteristic of living in Meadowbrook Estates. New residents moved in who had never heard of Deborah Pembroke or the Great Salt Incident. The community became just a normal subdivision, which was what everyone had wanted all along. I learned a lot from the experience, though. I learned that documentation is everything, that standing up for yourself matters even when it is difficult, and that institutions like HOAs only have as much power as people give them. I learned that abusers of authority rely on their targets being isolated and intimidated, and that fighting back often inspires others to do the same. I also learned that sometimes the right thing to do is also the profitable thing to do, though that should not be the primary motivation. I had been fully prepared to spend more money than I would recover just to make a point about property rights and accountability. The fact that it ended up being financially beneficial was a bonus. The business continued to grow. By the 3rd year after the incident, I had 5 employees and was bidding on commercial contracts for office parks and shopping centers. The landscaping side of things expanded too, and I ended up hiring a full-time crew just for that aspect of the operation. I sometimes got asked about the HOA situation during networking events or when meeting new clients. It had become a minor legend in the contractor community around Aurora and Naperville. The guy who took on his HOA and won, and then got them arrested for theft. People liked the story because it was about standing up to petty bureaucratic tyranny, which most people could relate to. I always tried to emphasize that I had not been looking for a fight. I had just wanted to be paid for my property that someone took. The escalation was entirely on Deborah's side, driven by ego and an inability to admit when she was wrong. I had just responded appropriately at each stage, but I understood why people liked the narrative. David versus Goliath, homeowner versus HOA, individual rights versus bureaucratic overreach. It hit all the notes of a satisfying story, especially because it ended with accountability rather than the little guy getting crushed. The Irving protocol continued to evolve. Patricia served 2 terms as HOA president and then stepped down, replaced by a younger guy named Marcus, which confused everyone at first given my lawyer's name. The new Marcus was actually great, bringing a tech-forward approach to community management with an online portal for submitting requests and tracking enforcement actions transparently. The neighborhood became something of a model for other communities in the area. Representatives from other HOAs would sometimes request tours or meetings with board members to learn about the governance structure. It was weird to think that my refusal to let someone steal my salt had indirectly led to meaningful reform in multiple communities. 5 years after everything happened, Bill and I were in our usual spots on a warm evening in June when a car pulled up. A woman in her 30s got out and walked over, looking a bit uncertain. "Are you Nathan Irving?" she asked. "That's me. Can I help you?" "My name is Rebecca Chen. I'm dealing with an HOA issue in Schaumburg, and someone told me I should talk to you. Do you have a few minutes?" Bill excused himself to give us privacy, and I spent the next hour listening to Rebecca's story. It was depressingly familiar. An overzealous HOA board member on a power trip, arbitrary enforcement of rules, retaliation when she objected. Different details, same pattern. "So what did you do?" she asked when she finished explaining. "How did you fight back?" I walked her through the process. Document everything. Get a lawyer if you can afford one. Don't be intimidated by official-looking letters or threats. Understand your actual legal rights versus what the HOA claims they can do. Be willing to go to court if necessary. But here's the most important thing, I said. You have to be willing to see it through. These people count on you giving up because it is too much hassle. If you start the fight, you have to finish it. Otherwise, you just make things worse for yourself. She nodded seriously. "I'm ready. I'm just tired of being pushed around." "Then you're going to be fine. Let me give you Marcus Webb's contact information. Tell him I sent you. He'll give you good advice on whether you have a case." Rebecca left looking more confident than when she arrived. I never heard how her situation turned out, but I hoped it went well. These encounters happened occasionally. Word had gotten around that I was willing to talk to people dealing with HOA problems. I was not running a consulting service or anything formal, just offering advice when asked. It felt like a way to pay forward the vindication I had received. The business eventually grew to the point where I was spending more time on management and client relations than on actual landscaping or snow removal. I hired an operations manager to handle day-to-day logistics, which freed me up to focus on growth strategy and major client relationships. One of those major clients was, ironically, an HOA. Not Meadowbrook Estates, obviously, but a large planned community in Batavia that wanted a comprehensive landscaping and snow removal contract. The property manager who contacted me knew about my history, and specifically said they wanted to work with someone who understood homeowner perspectives. The contract was substantial, about $70,000 annually. Signing it felt like a weird full-circle moment. I had gone from being victimized by an HOA to being a preferred vendor for one that actually functioned properly. "Does this make you a hypocrite?" Bill joked when I told him about the contract. "Only if all HOAs are bad," I replied. "They're not. The concept of shared governance for common areas makes sense. The problem is when petty tyrants get control and forget they're supposed to serve the community, not rule it. Very diplomatic. I'm a businessman now. Diplomacy is part of the job." The years continued to pass. I got married, which was a whole other story unrelated to HOAs but very important to me personally. Her name was Whitney Summers, and she found the entire salt incident hilarious when I told her about it on our third date. "So you're telling me you got someone arrested over rock salt?" She said, laughing. "Over theft and abuse of authority," I corrected. "The salt was just what they stole." "I'm giving you such a hard time about this. You know that, right?" she did, lovingly and frequently. Every winter when I brought home salt supplies, she would joke about keeping it locked up and setting up security cameras. When we got married and she moved into my house in Meadowbrook Estates, she insisted on reading the entire Irving protocol. "This is so extra," she said after finishing it. "There's a whole section on salt storage because of you." "There's a section on reasonable storage of business materials," I corrected. "It is not specifically about salt." Sure. We were happy in the neighborhood. The HOA under its reformed governance was barely noticeable, which was exactly what an HOA should be. Dues were reasonable, common areas were maintained, and there was no drama or tyranny. Bill and his wife became close friends with us. We did dinners and barbecues, celebrated holidays together, and generally lived the quiet suburban life that people move to places like Meadowbrook Estates to find. About 7 years after the original incident, I got a Facebook message from someone I did not know. Her name was Jennifer Martinez, and she said she had bought Deborah Pembroke's old house. "I've been hearing stories about what happened before we moved in," she wrote. "Just wanted to say thank you. This neighborhood is great, and apparently it used to be a nightmare. My neighbors say that's because of you." I did not know how to respond to that. I had not set out to be a neighborhood hero. I had just wanted to be paid for my salt. But the consequences of standing up for that basic principle had genuinely made life better for a lot of people. "Just did what anyone should do," I wrote back. "Glad you're enjoying the neighborhood." But privately, I felt proud, not in a boastful way, but in the quiet satisfaction of knowing that doing the right thing had mattered. The system worked when you were willing to use it. Accountability happened when you demanded it. Communities improved when someone cared enough to fight for that improvement. The business continued to thrive, eventually growing to the point where I had to decide whether to keep expanding or consolidate at a manageable size. Whitney and I had started talking about kids, which made the work-life balance question more pressing. I ended up selling the snow removal side of the business to another contractor who had been after it for years. It was a good deal financially, and let me focus exclusively on the landscaping work, which I enjoyed more anyway. The sale meant I was no longer storing massive quantities of salt in my garage, which Whitney thought was hilarious. "End of an era," she said when we cleared out the last of the equipment. "Good riddance. I'm done with salt." "But it made you famous." "It made me a pain in the ass with a good lawyer," I corrected. "Not the same thing." Still, I kept one bag of rock salt in the garage, sitting prominently on a shelf with a little plaque that Whitney made. "The salt that started it all." It was silly and sentimental, but every time I looked at it, I was reminded that standing up for yourself matters. The neighborhood continued to evolve. New families moved in, kids grew up, people retired and moved away. The community changed, as communities do, but the fundamental character established in the wake of Deborah's removal remained. Meadowbrook Estates was a place where residents had rights, where the HOA served rather than ruled, and where someone would speak up if that balance shifted. I ran into Eddie Marsh one more time, years later at a community event in downtown Aurora. He was doing well, had gotten married, and seemed to have completely turned his life around after the probation and job loss. "I think about what happened a lot," he told me. "It was the worst thing that ever happened to me at the time, but honestly, I needed that wake-up call. I was just going along with whatever my bosses said without thinking about whether it was right, Now I question things. I make my own judgments. I'm a better person for it, even though it sucked getting there. I'm glad it worked out, I said, and I meant it. That was the thing about the whole situation. It had been awful while it was happening. The stress, the harassment, the uncertainty about whether fighting back would even work. But in the end, everyone involved probably grew from it in some way. I learned about standing up for my rights. Eddie learned about personal responsibility. The neighborhood learned about the dangers of unchecked authority. Even Deborah, wherever she was, presumably learned something about consequences. 10 years after finding my driveway inexplicably salted and my supply mysteriously depleted, I was sitting on my back deck watching Whitney play with our 2-year-old daughter in the yard. The business was stable and profitable. The house was paid off. Life was good. Bill came around the side yard with beers, still maintaining our tradition even though we had moved from the driveway to the deck. "Remember when your biggest problem was stolen salt?" he asked, settling into a chair. "Simpler times," I agreed. "Think you'd do it all again, knowing what you know now?" I thought about it. The stress, the legal fees, the months of harassment and uncertainty. Balanced against the justice, the reform, the better neighborhood, the boost to my business, the connections made and lessons learned. "Yeah," I said finally, "I would, it mattered." And it did. Sometimes standing up for something as simple as 50-pound bags of rock salt means standing up for the principle that people cannot just take what is not theirs. That authority has limits. That abuse will be checked if someone is willing to check it. My story was not dramatic in the grand scheme of things. No one was in physical danger. No great injustice was corrected. It was just a suburban homeowner who refused to let an overzealous HOA president get away with theft and then escalate into harassment when confronted. But those small stands matter. They are the foundation of functional communities and civil society. When someone takes what is yours, you say no. When they retaliate, you stand firm. When they try to intimidate you into backing down, you follow through. The salt was just salt. But the principle was everything. And that is how a middle-aged woman named Deborah Pembroke, wearing a fleece vest and wielding an HOA gavel, learned that some people will not roll over. Some people will document everything, hire lawyers, and see things through to the bitter end. Some people will turn stolen rock salt into criminal charges and community reform. Whitney called me in for dinner and I headed inside, leaving Bill to enjoy the evening air. Life moved forward. The neighborhood thrived. The business grew. And somewhere in Indiana, I hoped, Deborah Pembroke had learned to ask before taking other people's property. Because if she had not learned that lesson, well, someone else would have to teach it to her the hard way, just like I did.